All right, so we are Wednesday, week 8. We are officially starting our second chapter of the, what do we call it, of Unit 2. So we are starting respiratory physiology. I really get excited about respiratory physiology because it allows me to talk a lot about my time in hyper and hypobaric chambers. So I was lucky when I was in the Air Force, I was stationed in chambers that we could suction air out and make the pressure in the chamber similar to altitude. And we'd ask people to go up to 30,000 feet and take their masks off so they could experience that really high altitude, low air pressure, low oxygen availability, and see what it felt like, and then put their mask on and see how quickly they could get back to coherent. And I love to show videos of that, of some of that stuff. And then because I was in a tropical island, Okinawa is like equivalent to Miami, and there's a beautiful coral reefs and there's beautiful scuba diving. So of course, we also, our chamber, we had a dive chamber, which was a hyperbaric medical chamber. And hyperbaric medicine has really picked up. So some of you might end up at hospitals and could end up being nurses in and around hyperbaric medical treatment areas. And we would do a lot of our treatment there for scuba diving, people who did stupid things. They would go really deep. And when you go down to about 60 to 70 feet of seawater above you, that water pressure is going to double the atmosphere, triple the atmosphere every 33 feet. And then when people realized, oh, I've been down here an hour and a half and I'm almost out of oxygen on my tank, and then fly to the surface, they create a pressure gradient, and we'll learn about it. And nitrogen gases decided I'm going to equalize and do that, coming through the skin, coming through and bubbling and making getting stuck in places. So we would dive people for decompression sickness. But because hyperbaric medicine is known to help with wound healing, is known to help with air embolisms, I got to see some crazy crap. We got to dive this one kid who had his nose bitten by his roommate. The original story was a dog bit it. But, you know, Marines drunk and isolated in Okinawa. Later on, the story became he and his roommate got in a fight, and one of them bit the other's nose. He had a graft, and the graft was dying, so we had to dive him to try to save the skin graft. I don't know if he ended up helping or ended up having eventually to do a different flap, but it was still cool to do that kind of dive. And then there was another one where and some of you, you know, the helicopter nurses, the people who do the, again, on the airplanes, the evacuation. I mean, you can end up being a flight nurse. So the pararescue or the paramedic type individuals in the military, and they were doing an exercise, and they were going to put a line in one of the guys, because he was the dummy, the practice guy, and he was they got too much air in the line, and when they shot it in, he got an air bubble, and I mean, he went in on a stretcher, and because of hyperbaric medicine, he walked out. So it's really, really some interesting things, and I hope to share them as the examples and reiterate some of the examples. But anyway, so I really like this chapter, although respiratory does have some challenges because we're talking still about pressure changes, we're still talking about physics, and we're still talking a lot of chemistry, and I know all of you people love physics and chemistry, so of course this chapter is a little challenging at times. Okay, so big picture functions of the respiratory system. We have to get oxygen in, and then with the cardiovascular system, that oxygen is then delivered to the tissues of the body, and then the cells and tissues take the oxygen with the glucose and with the amino acids, and they do their metabolism. They build things, they break things down, and some of the waste products will be picked up and respiratory system has the ability, along with the urinary and the skin and some of the digestive, that we can then remove some of the waste products. And the waste products we're going to remove in the respiratory system are going to be tied to carbon dioxide. And because carbon dioxide, when you put it in water, so if I had a bucket of water and I pushed a lot of carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide, when it goes into the water, is going to form a chemical molecule, carbonic acid. And what do acids do by definition in chemistry? When you put them in water, well, carbon dioxide has formed an acid in water, so then it's going to dissociate into bicarb and a hydrogen ion. So by breathing carbon dioxide out, by using my breath to help monitor carbon dioxide levels, I'm also controlling my acidity of my blood and my body waters. So a secondary function of the respiratory system is going to be to play a role in the acid-base balance of our system. And then as we move the air across the glottis and those vocal cords in our larynx region, we can make sounds. And as we manipulate and learn how with our tongue and our lips, and again, different languages, so some are more guttural, some are more oral and lingual, we can create different sounds and create language. And then with breathing through the nasal passageways, we detect odors, and then that's also tied in digestive system, because then we help our taste system. Okay, so anatomically, when we organize the respiratory system, we can organize it in two ways. We can go, all right, let's just draw a line, an artificial line, and say this is the upper and this is the lower. Okay, that's one way to do it, just anatomically. The upper respiratory tract, usually from the trachea, larynx up, and then the lower passageways will be the lower respiratory tract. All right. Or you can go, all right, let's do it functionally. What are areas where air is just going through the piping to get to the lower regions where then air and gas exchange is occurring? And so the conduction zone would be everything where the air is just moving and there's no exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And so that is basically most of the respiratory system into the lungs to around the 2 to the 16th, 2 to the 17th division of the primary bronchioles, where we then would start to see the showing up of alveolar air sacs that are then allowing capillaries and air to get close to each other, and that would then be the respiratory zone. All right, so where the air gas exchange is occurring, that's the respiratory zone. Where the air is just moving in pipes and tubes, that's the conduction zone. And remember, the air gas exchange area in both lungs, those little segments of closely capillary air, millimeters of space, if we take all that and move it together, there's analogies out there that it makes about half a tennis court worth of surface area. So it's a lot of surface area. Whether it is really half a tennis court or not, it's a lot of surface area. And that surface area is then what allows us, in given 3 to milliseconds, lets oxygen, again with pressure gradients, move in and get bound up, and so more oxygen is continuously pulled in. And then on the flip side, lets carbon dioxide move out, and then because it's an open container, continue to be moving out towards the atmosphere that has less than 1% of the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Okay. This is just a list again of many of what is considered the respiratory organs and respiratory landmarks and features. All right. Okay. Now, back in chapter 1, we talked about serous membranes, and chapter 4, and we learned about the pleural cavities. Okay, and we talked a little bit about this in lab yesterday and how important they are. All right, so pleural cavities, again, are going to be created by two membranes. The membrane that's closer to the superficial parts of the body, the ribs, the diaphragm, the intercostal muscles, the clavicle, that is going to be your parietal pleural membrane. Okay, and so your parietal pleural membrane would be, I guess, this black line between what's shown in orange, which is the thoracic, features of the ribs, the cartilage, the diaphragm, and the space in the middle, which is the pleural cavity. So this little black line over here, the innermost part facing the pleural cavity should be simple squamous epithelium, and then the underlying connective tissue is going to be initially some areolar connective tissue, so capillaries can get close, and then there'll be some fibroblasts, some neutrophils, eosinophils, mast cells, lymphocytes, immune cells in there. There can be adipocytes in there because it's connective tissue, and there'll be a large little bit more collagen and elastin fibers that allow the connective tissue part of the parietal pleural membrane to then merge into the perichondrium around the costal cartilage, the periosteum of the ribs, and the epimyosin of the connective tissue of the muscle. Okay, and that's how the parietal membrane is attached into those features that are forming the thoracic cage and the thoracic wall. All right, there's going to be a little bit of serous fluid. And again, water as a molecule wants to organize itself in a way that when you put water in this cavity, it's going to create surface tension and suction. All right. And then the black line here that represents the visceral pleural membrane, it's going to have simple squamous epithelium, then it's going to have areolar connective tissue, and then some more dense irregular connective tissue that forms a little bit of the merging of the capsule of the lungs. All right, and again, it's going to tie that visceral pleural membrane to want to, with the lungs, collapse with elastic recoil, collapse with water surface tension in the alveoli. And so these two membranes and their suction between them in the pleural space with the water there is what keeps your ribs and your thoracic cage from really pulling all the way maximally out. So they're pulled in, so there's room to pull out and there's room to revert back. And then the lungs being pulled with this, again, suction in the pleural cavity is what keeps some of the lungs from fully recoiling into the smallest lung space possible, keeps them a little bit inflated. And so your pleural cavity is hugely important because it, again, puts the lungs in a slightly inflated place, so the lungs can be pulled with the thoracic ability to move a little bit more open, so inhalations can occur, and then everything can relax back to resting and let exhalation occur. But there's room to, if I squeeze and let elastic recoil and I squeeze and let muscles push, I can let, again, the elastic recoil to make the lungs a little smaller, and I can maybe more forcefully exhale a little bit more air out. All right, so this space is critical to set the lungs and the thoracic cage in a place where they're not fully all the way out, they're not fully all the way in, and I can work in these confines of, I can move them a little more out or a little more in as I need to for inhaling and exhaling. Okay, now the pressure in the pleural cavity, you're going to hear it sometimes referred to as a negative pressure. It's really not negative, all right? It's still a force of, if I take the amount of force and push it on mercury, it's going to make mercury rise in a glass tube to a certain height, all right? And the amount that it's going to rise is going to be just slightly less than what the atmosphere is pushing on mercury, making mercury rise to a height. And so the atmosphere, again, if I was to have a bowl of mercury right now, and I let the atmosphere, and I think of the atmosphere as a bunch of stacked mattresses, and the mattresses are stacked on top and they're pushing on this mercury, and the mercury's forced to come up to a certain height in a glass tube. The atmospheric pressure is typically about 760 millimeters of mercury height that the mercury rises. In English units, it's 29.92 inches, all right? And you don't realize it, but you actually see inches and the pressure of the atmosphere all the time in weather reports. So if you go to your weather app right now and you look for it, you probably will see that it's somewhere listed on there. It tells you like today's atmospheric pressure is 29.98 or 30.1 or 28.99. So you're getting what the stack of atmosphere mattresses is today in Kirkwood or St. Louis, Missouri, pushing on mercury. You get that all the time in your weather apps and your weather reports, okay? And that's the outside pressure. Inside the alveoli, inside the air sacs, that's your pleural pressure or your intra-lung pressure or intra-pressure for the lungs. And those pressures, atmosphere and the alveoli, those are the ones that are trying to equalize. The pleural pressure is the pressure inside the pleural cavity. And because of water in there and because of the water kind of suctioning things together, the pressure of the fluidy air in the pleural cavity is going to always be slightly less than atmosphere. And so when we look at it, it's going to be somewhere around 756, and the atmosphere is usually 760. So if we just say, what's the difference that exists between these two? It's -4 millimeters of pressure. And since the negative is in there, that's why sometimes you hear pleural pressure is negative pressure. It really isn't. It's just usually a little less than the atmosphere, and you report it as, oh, the pleural pressure is -4 millimeters, meaning it's 4 less than what the atmosphere is right now. And when you inhale, it might get more negative, meaning the difference between the atmosphere and the difference between the pleural pressure goes from -4 to -6 or -8. Okay? And you always want your pleural pressure to be, again, just a little bit less than atmosphere and lung, because that's what's, again, keeping the ribs pulled in and keeping the lungs pulled out and creating this place where I have a little bit of movement. If the atmosphere and the pleural pressure ever equalized, these two things would probably separate and would not stay together, and you'd completely collapse your lungs, and you could completely bow out your thoracic cage ribs, and you wouldn't be able to reinflate because nothing is in a place where you can move it and manipulate it. Okay, so that's a really important concept, and we'll talk about it some more. And we can, if you still don't understand, let's talk about it in lab tomorrow, or let's talk about it, make an appointment, and we can have a little small group and discuss it again. All right. So pleural cavities are super important. The pressures that we're going to be interested in is what is atmospheric pressure, what is the pleural cavity pressure, and then what is the pressure inside the alveoli. The pleural cavity pressure is usually going to stay negative compared to the other two, so a little less. The other two, the pressure of the atmosphere and the pressure in the lungs inside the alveoli, those are going to change whenever we want to inhale or exhale. Whenever we want to inhale, we want to make the atmospheric pressure higher than the lungs. And so that way air will flow in. Whenever we want to exhale, we want the lung pressure to be greater than the atmosphere. So again, per the rules, air flows from high pressure to low pressure, air will flow out. And we do that through one of our phases of respiration. All right. And one of our phases of respiration is called ventilation. So ventilation is the breathing part. It is changing the lung size so that we create a pressure gradient with the atmosphere, so air flows in on the inhale, and then on the exhale, air flows out. All right. Now, when that air is coming in, hopefully the air that is coming in has oxygen in it. All right. If you are trying to potentially, and this happens every now and then in the mining world, if they get into a cavity or a cave that's been sealed off and they go in there and it's full of carbon dioxide or it's full of nitrogen gas and they breathe that air, well, when they take a breath, because they're not breathing in oxygen, it's possible that they could become hypoxic or anoxic and not be able to continue to thrive because they're breathing air that doesn't have oxygen in it. This is a worry that if we keep killing all the rainforest and all of our plants, and our plants are not taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and converting it to oxygen, that our oxygen levels of the atmosphere could go down, our CO2 levels could rise, and the air we start to breathe could not be sufficiently with oxygen to support life. All right. So again, the air we breathe, we will look at, and that's important, but just getting air moving in and out is ventilation. And that's our first phase of respiration. And then once we get the air in, and the air we get in has sufficient oxygen to, again, now for a pressure gradient, drive oxygen into the blood and into the chemical reactions to carry a lot of it. Now we need to bring it to the cells, offload it, and let the cells then do chemical reactions. And if you really want to get into the purpose of oxygen and chemical reactions, you're going to love organic and inorganic chemistry, because much of what happens in reactions of molecules being built and broken apart come back to oxygen and water molecules playing a role. And again, there's electrons being pulled and molecules and bonds and blah, and it's all kind of crazy. All right. So if that interests you, you need to be in chemistry classes. Okay. Okay, so go do a special. And he is having trouble, so he has to go in, and so we can't have a Zoom meeting with this. Okay, so then. And our special for the rest of the day is art. Okay. The rest of the week is art. Okay, can you go do some art then, so I can finish my thing? Thank you, bud. All right, so one of the other things you're going to hear about with the respiratory system is what exactly is respiration? What exactly does it mean? And there's lots of definitions out there. And many of you have probably heard about cellular respiration being a process where the cells make ATP and use fuel to create and meet its energy needs. All right. So respiration usually is going to be some type of chemical process and reactions that oxygen is involved in. All right. And so when we look about the respiratory system, there can be some definitions of respiration occurring where oxygen is involved in some chemical reactions, and we are going to better define them. So respiration, that is external respiration. These are going to be the chemical reactions where oxygen is coming into our system and we are not using it maybe at this point to make ATP and produce energy, but we're making oxygen part of some chemical reactions that help bind it and carry it to other locations. All right. And so external respiration is going to be involved in ventilation, where oxygen is coming in. Oxygen is going to be forced into, some of it is going to, again, if I have a tub of water, some of the oxygen is going to be forced into being a dissolved molecule. And the rest of it, when I put it in that blood, because of hemoglobin, is going to get put into a bound molecule and carried then as a bound form of molecules. All right. And again, oxygen gas, oxygen as a molecule, is involved in some chemical reactions. So that's why it's external respiration. All right. When I get to cells and tissues, I'm going to reverse some of my external respiration chemical reactions, and now oxygen is going to go into the cells, and now it's going to be part of that more traditional cellular respiration process where I take fat, where I take protein, where I take glucose, and I basically cut carbon-carbon bonds, liberating energy from carbon-carbon bonds into phosphate bonds that I can then break and make as I need energy and as I need the cell to do energy processes. All right. So those kind of reactions, the oxygen becomes an electron acceptor, becomes part of making water molecules and part of the process of using fuel to make energy. Right? And that's where you have the electron transport chain and the Krebs cycle and those glycolysis, right? So that part of respiration, again, is your traditional cellular respiration. Again, respiration can be any type of, for our purposes, chemical reactions where oxygen is going to be part of binding or breaking or being part of a molecular process. All right. In external respiration, that's oxygen getting bound into hemoglobin and being carried. And then in our internal respiration, it's the cellular respiration where it's part of the process where fat, glucose, and amino acids are used to make ATP molecules, and ATP molecules are used as an energy stored molecule because it's easier for our cells to make phosphate bonds and break those bonds when it needs energy versus trying to do it at a carbon-carbon bond level. Okay, now hypoxia versus anoxia. All right, anytime oxygen is not sufficient, so there's oxygen here, but it's not sufficient for normal function, that is considered hypoxia. Okay, and remember, hypo usually means low. So there's oxygen, but the oxygen levels are not sufficient for normal function. All right, and this is what we learned with flying. So when we go up in altitude, even balloons, all right, as we go up in altitude, again, think stacked up mattresses. As we go up in altitude, the mattresses at the bottom are really, really flat and smashed, and there's a lot on top keeping them, right? But as we go up in oxygen, I lose a few mattresses, and the mattresses start to be more fluffy, more, expanded upward, okay? That means as I go up in altitude, the pressure, the total pressure of all these mattresses pushing on mercury, the mercury is not going to rise as high. So my pressure, my total pressure is going to decrease. And as my total pressure decreases, the number of molecules that are bouncing and hitting each other, they're spreading out. That's why the mattresses are becoming more fluffy instead of more flattened. All right. And so as I go up in altitude, when I take a breath, I'm actually getting less oxygen because the molecules are more spread out. So I'm getting less total pressure, and in the molecules that I'm getting in, I'm getting oxygen for partial pressure with a breath. And so when I'm trying to think, when I'm trying to walk, when I'm trying to make coherent sentences, the amount of oxygen that I'm getting at altitude is not going to be sufficient for maybe me to have fully coherent thoughts and continue to work at a 9-minute mile pace or 16-minute walk pace if I'm exercising. That's considered hypoxia. And if I keep going up in altitude, the hypoxia is going to become more apparent to a point where the cells are going to become ischemic. They're not going to be getting enough oxygen to continue their normal function, and they can start to go into crazy mode and survival mode. And then if they continue to be lack of oxygen, they can start to die. Okay, so we figured this out, that when we go to certain altitudes in the old school airplanes that were not pressurized, people would kind of fall asleep and maybe not wake up in time to prevent their plane from crashing. A long while back, there was this golfer named Payne Stewart, and he was known because he wore the old school golf outfit, like the long socks and the little like knickers that his socks tucked into right below the knee. They were in a private airplane, and they think what happened was there was a leak in the cabin and the glass fitting of the cockpit. And so when they went up, and you go and you fly at altitudes at 20,000, 25,000, 30,000 feet. But if you don't realize that your pressuring system isn't working, the air in the cabin is equal to the atmospheric air. Well, that's why we do this training back in my Air Force days. When you're slowly, breathing this air that's slowly becoming more and more oxygen deficient, and your body is slowly getting less and less oxygen in and less oxygen to do normal function, you start to become hypoxic. And we always used to tell aircrew members hypoxia symptoms are insidious, meaning you don't realize that you're not thinking straight. You don't realize that you're kind of not getting all the information, and you don't realize that you're going to get to a place where you're not going to be able to be aware and fix your situation. And the Payne Stewart people, the airplane ended up crashing in Iowa, but it went off target by like 250 miles. And they think when random aircraft not responding to air traffic control, they marshaled some National Guard folks to go fly like their F-16s, that the cockpit was iced over, because again, any water pressure in the cockpit at 20,000, 30,000 feet is going to freeze, and there was no response. So they think the people basically got so hypoxic that they passed out, and then they passed away, and then the plane just flew on autopilot until it ran out of gas, and then it crashed. All right, so hypoxia can be very, very insidious. Now, your people who have a lot of lung disease and who have to be on oxygen all the time, they are always, again, usually the little thing on their finger, their pulse ox reading, they are usually, if they're not on oxygen, going to get hypoxia. And for those of you that have ever worked in the nursing home with people that if they go off their oxygen, or their oxygen line gets synced, or their oxygen tank gets empty and they're not breathing their oxygen supplement, they start to get kind of belligerent, they start to get kind of crazy, they start to get kind of like, just out of their mind a little bit, that's hypoxia for certain people as well. Those are some other different hypoxia symptoms. And so you as a nurse, you watch the docs reading, you watch and make sure the oxygen canister still has sufficient amount of oxygen in it. You watch for, again, if they're coherent, that they can continue to right mind, answer questions. They can continue to, focus their attention and respond appropriately. And when they don't, and you look at their pulse ox, and again, hypoxia can be represented at 92% saturated, 90% saturated, 89, 88. And then when you put them on their oxygen and they get a few breaths and they get that oxygen to their tissues and a few heartbeats, it's amazing the dramatic change that going from 88 to back to 95% saturation or 96% saturation can do for your mental ability. All right. Now, anoxia, again, if you put A in front of a word, it's supposed to be without. So space would be considered anox. There is basically no atmospheric pressure in space. So if you were to try to take your clothes off in space without the spacesuit and the pressurization system, one, you'd freeze because there's no heat there. But two, you would immediately take a breath with no oxygen and you would not be able to deliver any oxygen to your system. So that's anoxia. It's complete lack of oxygen. We usually deal on Earth with people who get in various degrees of hypoxia, but in space it would be anoxia. Or if you ever end up in a situation, like I said, you walk into this, like they find this old tomb that's been sealed off and you walk in and there's no oxygen in there, people could potentially take a breath or two and pass out and collapse because it's an anoxic environment. Okay. All right, so those are some of the, again, ways. You're going to see, again, hypoxia. People do not have sufficient oxygen. And when we don't have sufficient oxygen, getting to our nervous system, getting to our muscles, we are going to start to hyperventilate. And then you potentially have hyperventilation and acid-base issues, and then lack of oxygen issues. And those two things synergistically lead to people turning really, really quickly. All right. If you go, I don't know if there's a way, hold on, Igor. If you do a search on your YouTube, and I used to love showing this video, and it's called Hypoxia 4 of Spades, okay? This hypoxia video, the 4 of Spades, is absolutely amazing. It shows you a training that we would do back in my air days. We'd put people in the chamber. We'd tell them, drop your mask. They're breathing air that's around 30,000 feet. And we just had the guy look at cards, and all he had to do was say what the card was and show everyone. And hypoxia, like I said, you take a few breaths of oxygen depleted air, oxygen low quality air, and he didn't realize that his brain was not really registering anymore, and he got stuck with this 4 of spades. And then he would pull up like a 2 of hearts, and he's like, 4 spades, 4 spades. And he's doing the motions of, this is the task I know I'm doing, but I can't register because my brain's not working and firing correctly with oxygen depletions and oxygen unavailability, that this card is now the Queen of Hearts, or this card is the Jack of Diamonds. I'm stuck on, the last thing my brain remembers, coherently, was the 4 spades. 4 spades, 4 spades. And he can't even answer questions. He can't, every question is, how are you feeling? 4 spades, 4 spades. Do you think it's time to put your mask on and put your oxygen on? 4 spades, 4 spades. And he's just in this loop of, that's the last thing that his brain processed before the oxygen depletion hit him. And then what's crazy is, when they put the mask on, and when we put mask on air crew, we also put mask with pressure. So he's getting oxygen-rich air with pressure to help even push more oxygen into the system. And within a few seconds, he pulls up the next card. Queen of Hearts, Queen of Hearts. And he recovers like that. And the joke was, hey, you sure that's not a 4 spades? So watch the video, and it just shows you how hypoxia is very, very, very insidious. And he has no idea, and he's not coherent enough to really make the decision like, oh my God, I'm not able to answer questions. I'm not able to do what I should be doing. I'm stuck here. And he's an example of hopefully what air crew shouldn't do, which is let the process go that far. All right, Igor, let's look at your question. Does hypoxia damage the lungs? Well, again, if the lung tissue is becoming hypoxic, like the heart, like the brain, yes, any cells that are becoming hypoxic enough and then are trying to make ATP without oxygen available, they can become ischemic and they could become, yes, sick, and they can become eventually dead, given enough time. But if you are correcting it quickly when you recognize the symptoms, then you can hopefully avoid the cell death. It's like kind of like a stroke. Like if you can get the stroke, the reason why, if it's a clot or an air bubble, if you can get that removed before the cells downstream die, you can recover. So hypoxia is the same thing. If you can get the oxygen to the system before the long-term damage happens, you can recover. World War II, World War I, you got to also remember that many of these guys who were flying these airplanes, they didn't have a lot of filtering. They didn't have a lot of they were smokers, they were drinkers. So you can't pinpoint the lung problems to hypoxia. I mean, think about it'd be your great-grandparents, but I think about my grandparents, like everybody smoked back in the day. I mean, so you can't say that some of the lung problems weren't related to smoking. And then the farming community, DEET, my grandfather used pesticides because that was how they farmed, and they didn't always have OSHA masks on, and so some of the lung problems could have been for the exposure to the pesticides that were heavily used in the farming world. And again, most of your great-grandparents in World War I, World War II, farming was still a major lifestyle of them. So I can't quite confirm, Igor, that hypoxia is the reason for the lung problems. Could it have been a contributing factor if they were experiencing a lot over and over and over again? Maybe, but there were other chemicals, exposure, and things that might also contribute. Remember, asbestos and lead paint, they had lots of other things going on back in that day. Okay, gas laws. These are the 4 gas laws I need you to learn, all right? Now, when we ventilate, we are going to use Boyle's law. And if you don't remember Boyle's law, we talked about Boyle's law in the heart with respect to the isovolumetric contraction, isovolumetric relaxation, and how the chamber and the blood in the chamber, if the chamber got smaller, the pressure went up. If the chamber got bigger, the pressure went down. Well, we're going to do the same thing with the lungs. When we make the lungs bigger, because the diaphragm pulls down and the intercostal muscles pull the lungs, or pull the ribs out, and the lungs go with that. The air in the lungs and the particles in the lungs have more space, so they spread out, so pressure drops. That is how we create a low pressure, and again, just a few millimeters, but a low pressure inside the lungs versus the atmosphere, and we inhale. And then when we let elastic recoil, and all those elastic recoil forces let the lungs go back to their normal positioning, well, now there's more air in there, there's more particles, and the volume got smaller. The pressure of the molecules in there are now hitting each other at a higher rate. The pressure goes up. Again, a few millimeters of mercury, and it flows out. All right, so that's Boyle's law, and it explains ventilation. Again, Boyle's law helped us with explaining why when we go up in altitude, the ears click, and why when we go down in altitude, especially when you go down in an airplane or you go down for scuba diving, you have to Valsalva to clear that airspace on the other side in your middle ear on your tympanic membrane. So Boyle's law is going to be, again, with the GI tract, and this is the funny part of the chamber. When you go up in the chamber, your GI tract is going to also expand. And as it expands, gases, if you had some very flatulent producing foods in there, are going to expand, and you might have to fart out more gas. And again, a bunch of teenage to young 20 boys given the opportunity to fart, and it's appropriate and okay to do so. Lots of chuckles usually in the chamber. And then when you take your mask off at 30,000 feet, you get to smell all of that. So that was always the big joke about the chamber was, oh, I need to go eat some bean burritos the day or two before to make sure that I get to fully fart out all this expanded gas, methane gas, and make that chamber nice and stinky for when we all take our masks off. Again, typical potty humor with young individuals. All right, so Boyle's law relates to that. Charles's law, we'll talk a little bit more, and I'm going to leave that to next time. I'm going to hit this again. But those of you with that work with gas canisters, those of you that potentially would work with oxygen canisters in an airplane or for scuba diving or any kind of compressed air, Charles' law is about how the gas in the, again, the chamber is not going to change, but the gas being pushed in, as more gets pushed in, it can get hot. Or as the gas is pulled out, it'll feel cold because, again, the heat's leaving. And then why you would never want to put oxygen canisters in a hot car and leave them. Those of you that ever, the old aerosol, like hairspray cans, they can explode. You know, this is why you don't leave them in hot cars because of Charles's law. Dalton's law we're going to talk about quite a bit in terms of, again, why we want to put oxygen on people to get the change of the air they're breathing, the oxygen partial pressure, why when you go up to altitude that can make you hypoxic, why when you go down into a hyperbaric chamber or a diving chamber, why the partial pressure of oxygen goes up, and why that oxygen under high pressure is considered potentially therapeutic and healing. So that's Dalton's law. And then Henry's is my decompression sickness. So this is my soda pop law. So again, everybody loves their soda pop with their fizz. Well, why your body can be like the soda can, the fluid, and why nitrogen gas or carbon dioxide gas or oxygen gas could potentially be the gas that forms the bubbles when the pressure gradients get too great. So we'll hit on that. So I want to leave you with that, just a little teaser and a little taste. And again, go look at the video. Again, a quick search on YouTube. Let me see if I can get to the share the screen. Again, it looks like this with the guy doing the 4 clubs. You can also watch the video with the people doing patty cake and how your motor control gets inhibited because, again, your muscles need so much oxygen to make all the ATP for actin and myosin interactions that when you don't have enough oxygen present, you're not going to have full muscle movement and control appropriately. So there's a lot of different ways that we test. And the reason why we make people do hypoxia training in the Air Force is because, again, historically, when the military planes were first created for World War II, they're unpressurized, and they were flying at these higher altitudes, and we found that they were falling asleep and dying. And so then we started creating pressurized systems. We started creating masks and pressurized breathing to be able to keep them alive. Now, we still have planes that are U-2 planes where the guys have to be in full-up spacesuits, and they have to have not only oxygen, but the whole canister around their face has to be pressurized and oxygen rich for them to fly at 60,000 feet. I mean, they're flying at basically space almost, that border where the atmosphere becomes almost space. And we have to keep them alive and breathing and awake while they're doing that. So it's still something we train people to realize because canopies in these airplanes, everything's fixed by the lowest bid, right? So leaks can happen, and we want people to be aware when you're flying at 30,000, 40,000 feet, what your symptoms of hypoxia would look like, and so you can get on oxygen, get on and get low, and save your crew and save the aircraft. Because again, an airplane crashing is easily a $1 to $2 million well, now they're like $40 million in airplanes. So it's definitely loss of life and huge loss financially. All right, so that's a fun video to watch that better shows you how just a little bit of oxygen not being present can have profound impacts on your nervous system, on your muscles, on your memory, on your ability to be cognizant and aware. And those of you that work, again, in nursing homes or work with people who have to be on supplemental oxygen, you know when their oxygen is depleted, when they have a kink in their chain, when they're not on their oxygen for extended periods of time, that they turn yo-yo crazy. This is why. They're hypoxic and they're not functioning on all cylinders. All right, so I'm going to stop the recording.